Okay, so I think I will begin. Um, and then, yeah. So thank you everyone for joining Local Talks this evening. My name is Randy and I will be hosting this session this evening. So just a little bit about Local Talks. It is a quarterly event. So we host one in March, June, September, and December every year. We always host them on a Wednesday from 6 to 8 p.m. And Local Talks is essentially a platform for really discussions and sharing about green design, architecture, and construction in East Africa. There's a lot more information about Local Talks on Local Works website. Local Talks was started by Local Works in 2020. And previous talks are available to be watched on our YouTube channel, on Local Works YouTube channel. So please do go backwards and watch and see other discussions that we have had. As you will see, this event today is being recorded, just to inform you, and will also be available like the others to watch afterwards. Today we have 3 speakers, and we are excited to present them to you and to have them with us today. The topic is Indigenous Landscapes, particularly in East Africa. And our subheading, or kind of what we're looking at generally, is how to, I guess, is the challenges of preserving nature and conservation amidst varying human needs and human development across this particular part of the world. So the 3 speakers, I will introduce the 3 of them to you very briefly. And then following that, they will speak in the order that they are introduced. So the first speaker we have is named Joannes Samikwo. He's a trained botanist and medical consultant with experience working in East Africa. In East Africa, in South Africa, India, and Nepal. He is currently the director of Multiplant International Medicinal Conservation Seed Bank in Kenya. And at this organization, Seed Bank in Kenya. Sorry, I think there's a bit of an echo. I don't know if it's still there. Hello? Testing. I think it's gone. Here he conducts training courses. He's a curator and he has authored a number of different field guides in Kenya. He is also a herb consultant, medicinal herb consultant at Plants for Life International and Sancha Trust Medical Garden, amongst other places. We also have Matt Cooper, who is one of the founding directors of Kyaninga Forest Foundation, and he previously worked with Steve Williams at Kyaninga Lodge. He is also currently completing a PhD through ETH in Zurich, but he's largely based in Uganda, where his research addresses the legacy effects of land conversion of forest recovery in Kibale Forest National Park. And he's passionate about preserving biodiversity and sees trees as a backbone to achieving this. And then finally, we have Chloe Humphreys, and she co-founded the Landscape Studio, which is a landscape design practice, with Michael Humphreys in Kenya in 2015. And this practice works on a range of different projects, from residential to mixed-use development, schools, conservation, religious, commercial, and hospitality. And in particular, they're quite careful with observing and understanding each particular situation and producing biophilic designs for these diverse projects in East Africa, but more recently also in Western Europe. And Chloe has also worked on a number of projects with us at Local Works, the majority of our projects. So we are happy to have her here with us today, amongst the others. So I think that's the brief introduction. I will now pass on. So Joannes will speak first. Just to the attendees, if you do have questions, please save them for the end. We'd love to hear anything you have to share in our discussion. But we'll let the speakers present and then open up at the end of these presentations. So let me share my screen.
Well, good evening, everyone. As my name's Joannes, as you are told as per the introduction. So I'm going to take you through the threatened species of Uganda. So I'm sorry, I couldn't do it on my side. So anyway, thanks Randy for your help. So I'll do it on your side under your help. So welcome. So trees in Uganda are disappearing due to various pressures on natural resources, human population increase, and industrial development pressure. Well, previously, intact habitats, both protected and on private land, have been converted, cleared, or degraded, leading to decline in species population and diversity. So the effects of climate change, which are hard to forecast in terms of pace and pattern, will probably also accelerate the extinctions in unknown ways. Next, please. Well, threat status of Uganda species. Well, some species are adaptable to such pressures, including the ability to thrive in human-modified landscapes, and are still numerous. Others are clearly on the decline. Harvesting of plants species for food, fuel, and building are just some of other pressures facing trees. Due to these direct and indirect pressures, some species are clearly reaching the point where the populations may no longer be viable in the country. Next. Well, conservation status in Uganda. So studies have been conducted to tally the number of plant species and fungi that still exist globally. However, the estimates normally produced are based on IUCN criteria that at times overshadows the national scales. And based on studies that have been carried out, list of national threatened species of vascular plants have been developed. This will continue significantly towards understanding of the status of the species relevant to Uganda context, culturally and economically, as well as reference for policy formulation and strategic decision making. Next. Well, in Uganda, we have endemic species, around 15 of them. So species which are endemic means species which are not found anywhere else in the world, outside the country or a specific area. These species also tend to be associated with areas of high biodiversity importance generally. This raises the profile of the species significantly as irrelevant to extinction in its country or area of origin. It automatically becomes globally extinct, in addition to species that are cited as endemic to Uganda. Species that may be from a confined area on the border with another country like Kenya. So the Uganda endemic species are only found within Uganda, may also be listed as near endemic, or i.e. more than 80% of the global population is likely to be within Uganda. So potentially endemic states, to be within Uganda or potential endemic, literature states that while it may occur outside Uganda, no record have been found, and so it can be treated as an endemic pending new records. So, for instance, Mount Elgon endemic are species only found on the Mount Elgon Massif and are thus present in a very small area of Uganda and the other side of Kenya. Next, please. So we have, as I said before, we have 15 threatened endemic species of Uganda. And well, these are Allotororana, Botrocline auriculata, Diospyros catendei, Encephalatos equatorialis, Sansevieria lineata, Senecio nafucabensis, Solanaceo garniroides, Allo mubendensis, Encephalatos macrostropilo, then Sabicaea interbensis, Allo echiorum, Cola congolana, Pharidendron magnificum, Sansevieria newtoniana, then Sansevieria subtilis. So conservation action, research into the potential economic benefit of threatened species is required, as well as gathering existing information on uses of threatened species and other species in the same genera. This will help engage and incentivize local communities in the conservation of the threatened species. Some uses are already known, i.e. for Cola congolana, mostly you've heard of the West African, the cola nut. So it's used as a cola nut, which produces a nut that is used medicinally for ED, erectile dysfunction. So Diospyros catendei is a good timber tree that takes over 30 years to produce good timber. Sansevieria subtilis, Encephalatos whitelockii have potentially ornamental value. Another potential incentive for farmers or others to plant could be the sale of seedlings in future for restoration and other plantings. So long-term conservation action with vast experience and expertise that Studio FH has in landscaping with indigenous trees. Studio FH is a service institution in implementing and overseeing the planting of threatened species, as well as advising further on conservation matters. An immediate action to support the scaling up of ex situ conservation work is to share information on habitat type, altitude for the target species to help identify suitable sites for ex situ conservation. Next. So current species, I did a survey in 2 major nurseries in Uganda. So then I found out that in the 2 nurseries, they only have few endemic species. So the 2 nurseries are Toro Botanic Garden Nursery and Arise Forestry Enterprise. Well, the main point was to find out how many endemic species they have or grow for conservation and research purpose. Next. Endemic and rare species in Uganda tree nurseries that we found. So the endemic at Toro Botanic Garden Nursery, none was found, and rare and endangered species, I only found 9 species. And in Arise Forestry Enterprise, endemic none, and rare were only 2 species. So next slide. While implementation strategy, a framework for implementation of identified priority actions, tracking conservation actions, and continuing collaborative work amongst workshop participants is given that maintaining tree coverage and restoring forest in Uganda is important for climate change, soil stability, watershed protection, provision of timber and non-timber forest products. And above all, the main point here is to protect and conserve Uganda's threatened tree species. So I think that's the end of my slide. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for sharing your presentation with us.
Am I out of time or I'm okay?
No, this is okay. Perfect timing. Thank you. I think we will move straight on to the next presentation and then come back for questions at the end. So
okay, so hold on one second. So my name is Matt Cooper. I'm one of the directors of Kyaninga Forest Foundation. We're a small NGO working in Fort Portal in West Uganda, where we promote tropical agroforestry. We work in 3 different districts: Kabarole, Bundabujo, and Chenjojo. And so I will just present a little bit about the background about the NGO, our approach, the issues that we face, and then the solutions that we see. So Kyaninga Forest Foundation was started in 2012. At this point, I was still working at Kyaninga Lodge, and we became very aware of the rapid rates of deforestation taking place. And so we started indigenous trees and giving these out to local communities just to try and combat the extreme levels of deforestation. Over the last 8 years, we've distributed around 60,000 indigenous trees, and because of that, we've seen the forest recover quite strongly, and also the biodiversity within the forest start to come back. This is just to show you, so you can see the transformation that's taken place within the lake. Lake Kyaninga is one of the deepest in the whole of East Africa, and like many of the volcanic crater lakes, has extremely steep slopes. And over the years, this has had advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that because the slopes are very steep, it's meant that the forest has remained largely intact because it's very difficult to get the timber out. The disadvantage is now that the deforestation pressures are so high that people are resorting to taking timber out of these last remaining forests, that you're getting rapid erosion take place on the slopes. But certainly in some areas of the forest, we are seeing some strong recovery. So Lake Kyaninga is part of the Kasenda Crater Lake Field, and this is sitting between Kibale Forest National Park and the Rwenzori Mountains National Park. And many of these lakes would have had forest on them, but a lot of them have now lost their forest. This is simply to do with increased pressure on these forests, and this is now causing problems for both of the national parks, both the Rwenzori and Kibale Forest National Park. We work closely with the Ugandan Wildlife Authority in trying to mitigate the effects of deforestation, but it's not easy. So the main issue that's been caused, or not the main issue that's been caused, but the main issue causing such deforestation is simply the large population growth that's taken place within the last 50 years within Uganda. And because within Uganda, the dominant source of fuel for cooking is firewood or charcoal, this has put huge pressure on the remaining forests. As you can see, between 1990 and 2015, 2.5 million hectares of forest has been lost. This roughly equates to about 100,000 hectares per year. And currently, the forest cover in Uganda has dropped to only 8%. There is a large push at the moment to push this forest cover back up. The World Bank and many other agencies are doing large-scale reforestation. Although many of the forests that are now being planted contain only exotic species, monocultures of eucalyptus and pine, which you can't really call forests since they don't provide the ecosystem services of a local forest. So within Uganda, there are different governance structures managing the forests. The Ugandan Wildlife Authority controls the national parks, and they are probably the wealthiest of the different governance structures, and as such, the national parks also have the strongest protection and are the most intact. Below that is the National Forestry Authority. They are generally responsible for the central forest reserves. And here the management is pretty good, although a lot of the forests now are also being converted to working forests. By that I mean like eucalyptus plantations or pine plantations, and so less pristine rainforests. And then under that, and this is the area where Kyaninga Forest Foundation works, this is with the local forests, lakes and rivers, and all of these are controlled by the National Environment Management Authority. Unfortunately, they have very little funding, which means that there are a lot of issues, and that's why we decided to try and work in this area. Within Uganda, there are very few community forests. Most of the forests, the larger forests, are either controlled by the NFA or the UWA. And because there is no community forest structure, any forests that fall out of the jurisdiction of the UWA or the NFA tend to disappear quite quickly, as there's no real clear ideas who owns them. So the legal framework within Uganda is actually very, very strong. And it means that the local forest is actually quite well protected in theory, and that only dry timber, dry wood can be taken out. Unfortunately, in the practice, this is not quite what happens, because most people are aware that you're only allowed to take dry wood and won't cut live trees anymore. But it's quite easy to enter a forest, cut a tree, and come back 6 weeks later once the wood has dried. The same goes for the lakes. Most of the lakes within Uganda are also protected by the NEMA authority, and should have a 100-meter protection zone around them. Sadly, in the practice, this isn't the case. Most of the lakes are very heavily degraded and eutrophied. Eutrophication is the process which happens once a forest is cleared along the edge of a water body. You get a lot of erosion and agricultural runoff into the water, and this increases the nutrient content within the water column, and this leads then to algal blooms, as you can see in the bottom lake here, turning the water green. And this usually then stops the growth of all other plants. The same is with the rivers. Most of the rivers in Uganda have a very strong legal framework, but it's very rarely enforced. This is within Fort Portal here on the right, and you can see the way the river is cutting away slowly, closer to the National Water Authority. And this is one of the areas where we also try to work to get tree planting along the banks of the rivers to provide some kind of stability. So the approach we have is a bit of a tool. It's called indirect participatory forest management. This basically means that we try to protect the forests by working with the communities that live next to them. Because most of the forests here are controlled by the UWA or the NFA, they have the jurisdiction to work in the forests, and we don't, so we can only work with the communities around them. So at the core of what we do is our nursery. This is the nursery about 8 years ago. It started off very small with just a few species, but now we have over 100 indigenous species within the nursery, and we distribute between 15 and 20,000 every season at the moment. One of the other ways that we go about trying to protect the forests is through monitoring. We have camera traps in the forest which give us an idea of the biodiversity of the forest. We also do weekly forest patrols where one of the staff and a member of the community monitor how many incidences of deforestation or charcoal burning or livestock encroachment are done within the forests. And we've also started trying to use drones as a way of calculating the amount of change that is taking place in the forest over time. We're also trying to conduct research on which species would be suitable to perform the same job as the exotic species in Uganda, as in most of the tropics, eucalyptus and pine are very popular because of their rapid growth rates. But unfortunately, as most people are aware, they have a lot of detrimental side effects, both to the soil, to the water column, to the fertility of the land. So we conduct experiments with indigenous trees, trying them in different mixtures to see how they can work to then be able to offer them to farmers as an alternative to eucalyptus. One of the other areas where we're really trying to create a change is with the land markings within Uganda. Land boundaries within Uganda are typically marked with a live fence, the same as was done in Europe for many years. And in Europe, these hedgerows would often be cut back every 10 to 15 years as a source of firewood, and then would regrow. These hedgerows end up creating biodiversity corridors, but also provide a sustainable source of firewood. In Uganda, however, probably because it wasn't needed up until now, most land boundaries are planted with euphorbia or fig species, simply because you can cut them, stick them in the ground, and they grow very easily. Unfortunately, both species provide very poor timber. They provide a lot of smoke, and so they're undesirable as a source of firewood. So we're trying to utilize this space and come up with ways of redoing these borders so that they contain useful species, either fruit trees, timber trees, fodder trees, medicinal trees. And so we conduct experiments with Mountains of the Moon University, one of the local universities here in Fort Portal, to see which trees will tolerate such environments, such pruning, and such management. We also work with habitat restoration. One of the areas we're working at is for the Mpanga Falls cycads. Cycads are an ancient group of plants. They predate the dinosaurs and are approximately over 250 million years old. Unfortunately, the Mpanga Falls cycad is critically endangered. There are only a few thousand left, and they only exist on one place on Earth, at Mpanga Falls. And unfortunately, this area has come under a lot of pressure in the last 10 years. And so we're doing our best to try and sensitize communities to the value of keeping this plant, but also to restoring the ecosystem as a whole. The next area where we're active is advocacy, and this is really trying to raise the profile of indigenous trees. We do this at any kind of government event where we're working, any kind of fair, any kind of radio station that we're invited to, as increasing the profile of indigenous trees is the only way to get people to start adopting them and seeing them as valuable. Up until now, indigenous trees are generally something that people see as growing naturally wild at the edge of the farm, but not with any real value. And so we're trying to change that. And one of the ways we're trying to change that is with our Kyaninga Roots program, which works with schools within the area. And here we set up environmental clubs with different age groups, and then invite the kids to come up to the nursery, see how we grow the trees, visit the forest, and also then understand the benefits of trees. We also set up nurseries within the schools themselves, where we teach the kids how to identify the trees, where to collect the seeds from, how to prepare the seeds, how to sow them in a bed, and then at the end of term, they get to take the trees home with them and plant them in the farming landscape. And we hope that that's going to have a long-term effect, so that the next generation, rather than turning to eucalyptus and pine, will have a greater understanding of using indigenous trees as an alternative. We also install posters into the schools. These are a way of highlighting the different benefits of trees. So we have a selection of 4 different posters that try to approach it from different aspects, showing the benefit of trees for people, but also for water, how trees can reduce erosion rates, how trees can reduce air pollution, and also the benefits that trees have for soil in terms of mulching, or in the way that trees stabilize the soils. So the core part of our business, this is the planting, and this is with smallholder farmers. We work with over 1,000 farmers in different areas, from cocoa farmers to coffee farmers, matoke farmers, the whole spectrum. And here we've learned over the years which species will tolerate which farming landscapes, and also try to manage the expectations of farmers. This is one of the critical things, is that because of the growth rates of eucalyptus and pine, often indigenous species are not as fast as those species, but they will, however, not have the detrimental effects that eucalyptus or pine have. Most of the exotic species often have very, very degrading effects on the soil, whereas the indigenous trees won't. Okay, sorry, one second. The program we're involved with, this is together with the Ugandan Wildlife Authority. As you can see, a lot of our stuff is around promoting indigenous species, and the sort of juxtaposition of that is to help remove some of the invasive species. In many parts of Uganda, there's a lot of problems with Lantana camara. This is an invasive shrub that was probably brought here as an ornamental sometime in the last 50 years. And other trees like cassia, which you can see here. These are both very heavily invasive species. And in Kibale Forest, this is actually stopping the forest from regenerating. And so one of the projects we have there is to remove the lantana. And then what we do is we take the lantana and we convert it into eco-charcoal. And this has the win-win situation that that Kibale Forest is rid of the exotic species, which allows the forest to recover. And the farmers have a viable source of organic matter which they can use to create the eco-charcoal. I won't go into the process of how it's done. It's a bit lengthy, but just to give you an idea of what can be done. All of this charcoal that you see here being used was made from exotic species and then mixed with household things like banana fiber leaves and anything, maize stems, any kind of organic matter that's lying around can be mixed together to form this eco-charcoal. So the feedback that we've had over the years is that people still prefer exotic species. We are seeing this change slowly, simply because people are aware that if you're growing crops, it's very difficult to intercrop eucalyptus or pine into a traditional cropping system. Either you have to do one or the other. You have a eucalyptus plantation, or you have your coffee and your matoke growing together. Whereas if you're using indigenous trees, you can integrate them into that farming system and they won't have negative effects on the yields. There is, however, very little knowledge remaining on the local species, but we're trying to strengthen that by doing these programs in the schools. And slowly more and more farmers are trying to join the program. So in conclusion, the biggest issues that we see causing forest loss are the two issues where it's a rapid increase in population, but also that there's such a reliance on trees for firewood and for charcoal. But I think this is something that can be fixed if we start to really utilize space within the farming system in a better way, utilizing the boundary area, for example, as a source of firewood instead of just a land boundary. And the benefit of doing that is that you then create these biodiversity corridors. And so this is a win for the farmer, but it's also a win for the ecosystem as a whole. And so the main point is that smallholder farmers are really key in any of these conservation issues, whether it's in Kibale Forest, whether it's in local forests or performing agroforestry. The majority of rural areas in Uganda are dominated by smallholder farmers, and so getting them on board with planting indigenous trees, I think, can really transform the landscape. Okay, that's it. I think I'm okay for time.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Matt, for your presentation. Really interesting. I think we'll just move that quickly on to Chloe and then see it.
Can you see my screen, everybody?
Yep, I can see.
Okay, so hi everyone.
Sorry, Chloe, I can't see. You haven't shared your screen. I can see you.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I thought I had. Let's see, 1 second. Now, can you see it?
Yeah, good.
Okay. So yeah, hi everybody. Thank you, Randy, for inviting us. I guess what I want to talk about is the role of sort of our role in design, in landscape design, and working with consultants, architects, and the like in sort of trying to preserve indigenous landscapes as much as possible within design, and the role that we can play in helping to conserve. So I'll go through a few projects as an example. Just to give a summary, we were a very small studio. It's my husband, Michael, and I, and then we've got a small team who work with us on a per project basis. We started a studio in Kenya, and most of our projects are still within East Africa, but we're starting now to work in Europe, which is really fun because we're we're now learning and observing about indigenous landscapes within the European continent as well. And it brings different challenges. So it's actually really interesting. And then within East Africa itself, it's just so diverse. It's really, really amazing. So within Kenya, we work on a big range of different indigenous landscapes. In Uganda too, Rwanda, it's all really distinct. So it's quite amazing working in these different environments and understanding the sort of how sensitive we need to be within the different ecologies. So I'll go through a few projects. This is a private house in the Masai Mara in Kenya. And the Masai Mara is one of the most famous wildlife reserves within Kenya. And I'm going to talk about two things. One, always within our projects, we try and use local materials for the hardscape, because it just means that from the sort of the carbon footprint of the project is much reduced if we're using stone or materials that we find right there on site. So this was a quarry that we found just above the site. So we essentially formed the hardscape of the project from this. But the most important thing in regards to this talk is our understanding of the local ecology. So in this setting, it's a grassland, very famous grassland. And so essentially what we decided to do is to create a garden using the plants that we found on a 5-kilometer radius, essentially, of the site itself. We didn't want to bring in any plants from elsewhere because we're concerned about bringing in invasive species into such a protected area. There's so many elements in regards to the health of the soils that you want to be very sensitive to. So essentially our challenge was to persuade the client, one, which is very difficult sometimes, of how we can create a garden just using these plants, and how do we make it feel like a garden. So this is the project in construction. You can see how we use, together with the architects, the local red stone. And we use the red stone standing on its edge. I'll show you that a little bit later. But because we've got hippos coming into this garden all the time, so we had to use the stone standing, so structurally it was much stronger. And then you can see here we use all the local grasses that we grew from seed, and aloes. It's basically aloe secundiflora, and then a different variety of different grasses. So this is just after sort of maybe a month after planting. And you can see the entrance path leading to the front door of the house. And this is something that I love doing, is whenever we come across plants pre-existing in the site, we make a space for it. So this is euclea in the middle of the path that we just sort of framed and made space for this tree in the middle. So by doing that, by sort of embracing what is already on the site and not cutting anything, essentially, you can really form interesting focal points from a design perspective. There she is again, my favorite tree. And again, just because I know there's a few architects on listening in, or I hope there are, the just sort of details of how we work with stone, because as landscape architects or as landscape designers, we're looking at both elements, how to work within the indigenous landscape and with the species that we're using, but also the human experience in regards to materiality, spatial, the sort of spatial allocations of spaces and things like that. So this is Milenis repens, again, an indigenous grass, which has got this beautiful pink seed on it, which works beautifully with the contrast of the grey and some elements of the architecture. And I'll show you the movement of the grasses, the different species we use, and sort of the textural movements, which for me is quite important. And the aloes flowering amongst the grasses. So it's really, by bringing these grasses that you see in the wider landscape close into the private garden, in a way it allows you to observe them closer at hand, which I think is important in adding value to the indigenous species found within the locale. You know, most people, if this wasn't part of the garden, you'd probably just be in your safari car and be driving amongst the grasses, but because you're walking past them and it's framed by a path, I think it sort of draws attention to the beauty of the species that belong within that biome, I guess. This again, you can see the secundiflora flowering through the different textural grasses that we use. So it's very simple, but it's fun to make a project out of what we find. So this is another project, again, in a totally different setting and different vegetation. And this is really exciting from a conservation perspective. This is on the Kenyan coast, near Kilifi. And what's happening in general on the Kenyan coast is most people cut down all the indigenous bush and shrub, and they plant lawns and hibiscus and palm trees, which of course is detrimental to the water table because it uses a lot of water, but also it means that the indigenous species are being lost. So this is when we first came to site. It was sort of an old neem plantation. We had to take out all the neems, but then there was lots of indigenous species coming up, and we really saw the value. It's very, very rare, this coastal forest. So we essentially persuaded the clients and discussed with the client the value of making a garden that embraced this natural vegetation, and rather than trying to destroy it, our whole philosophy in the concept and the design was to embrace it. So what we did was essentially create a series of paths through the garden. Some of the paths are really formal, like this, sort of a very informal transitory path. And you walk along these, and the bush is sort of around you, and then you come across these sort of larger statement paths, I guess. And the dimensions for these were really important for us. They're actually 3 meters wide, so essentially 3 people can walk very comfortably down this path, and you can sort of walk and talk, which I think moving through a landscape is something really interesting, and yeah, and can be very enjoyable. And the other thing which I liked, which a little bit like the Euclid and the path in the Masai Mara, whenever we came across trees, larger trees within the path, we left them. And so now what's happened, like this Sunflower Xylem has really grown. It was tiny when we first made the path, but it's really grown. And by the sort of path framing the vegetation, you draw attention again to the vegetation in some way. It's almost like putting a canvas around it. And of course, these Sunflower Xylem, they're so medicinal, and they've got these amazing thorns on the bark. So there's something very sensual about drawing attention to these species that were in our way, essentially. So we embraced them. This is just showing, I mean, it's so, the vegetation there is so amazing, and Joannes and Matt will know a lot more than I do in regards to all the species there, but it's really exciting how it comes to life in the rains, and then a lot of them are deciduous, so they drop their leaves in the dry, so it changes a lot. But anyway, this is, again, different series of different paths. As well as the vegetation, there's heads of coral that sort of come out of the ground, and again, those we embrace. So the paths, as well as sort of creating a sense of journey, they also frame these natural elements within the landscape, which normally you probably wouldn't see. It just becomes solid bush. Again, these different paths. And then this, again, is kind of fun. This was an old Italian stone fountain that the client had, that we repositioned in this garden. We brought it up from Nairobi and placed it here. And I like this sort of game that you have quite a traditional garden sculpture that you may see in a garden in Europe or something, and it's placed within this natural, this sort of more wilder setting. And in a way, it makes it seem more like a garden. So it makes the wild nature of the vegetation more acceptable, I guess, in a strange way. But essentially, in doing this, we are maintaining most of the site. We're leaving it to nature, and therefore we're leaving the landscape to return to its sort of rich ecology that it would have been before humans came around and sort of cut everything down and planted neem trees. So the regeneration in this has been really exciting. It's been really fun. This is another garden again, this is a grassland. This is one we're working with drones, actually, is fun, in northern Kenya. Just to show you a little bit the sensitivity of the different landscapes in which we work, and trying to be sensitive to that, not trying to bring in I don't know, plants and species that don't belong in there is one, but also for me is the tonality of the landscape from a design perspective. So this is a landscape which is very grey and very yellow, as you can see by these grasses. look at the grass. Don't look at the animals, look at the grass in the background. It's dominated by a pennisetum. Anyway, so this is again, it's a private house that's being built, and essentially the design is a series of courtyards adjacent to the house, and then outside of the house we're just leaving the grass, and we're adding in slightly different species to sort of add a slightly more interest, but essentially the garden is going to be made up of grasses, which already is, and these internal courtyards, which provide a little hint of garden, but essentially we're trying to embrace where we are. Again, for me, the hardscape material is really important. So this is a local stone, and the tonality of it, again, is quite important in how it fits into the wider landscape. So as well as the plants, we're also interested, obviously, in materiality and in movement through the garden. So these are the entrance paths leading to the entrance courtyard. They have sort of this staggered effect, which means that, again, from a sensation point of view, you have the grasses coming close to you at different points. So again, it's trying to bring you close to the plants within these ecologies from an experiential point of view. And again, our courtyard walls and this amazing landscape that's just outside. But again, the tonality of the materials is really important. And then the client, of course, they want a vegetable garden. And of course, I was really concerned because I'm really worried about the vegetable garden being too green in this landscape, because there's very little green. There's no green in this landscape. So essentially, we've done a walled vegetable garden, which includes low stone walls and then these timber sort of slats, which will silver. And then the vegetable garden's hidden in there. So you won't see a clash of green, which for me was really important. And yet at the same time, we have to be practical and in meeting the briefs of our clients. So how do we fit in a vegetable garden into this landscape without conflicting with it, essentially. This is another project in the Masai Mara Sand River, and this is just very, very quickly just to show you, again, from a design point of view, we had to create an entrance into this camp, this lodge, and there's movement all over. There's staff moving from the kitchen, there's guests coming in into the main, like, sort of sitting room tent, there's people coming from the bar, so there's movement all over. So our design was to create these very wide steps and these sort of gravel courtyards which allow free movement all the way through. But the key thing I want to talk about is the entrance steps, which embraced the indigenous, basically the existing vegetation, and we essentially built the steps embracing all of these croton that were existing. So we didn't actually cut any, we maintain them, we built the steps around them, and then we prune them up so you can walk through them. So again, trying to be as sensitive as you possibly can. The image on the bottom right shows nicely sort of how the steps weave through the existing vegetation. Again, it's the same thing, trying to respect what is in the sites, not trying to change it too much, trying to work the design and meet the elements of the brief by embracing these sort of natural landscapes that we're working in and that we're very lucky to work in. So there's a sense of respect of what is there, which I think has been so, with human pressures all over within East Africa, it's really an important thing that we need to try and address in design. And this is Gitao, I don't know. I mean, we can't build these projects without the amazing builders. And this is Gitao, who's our great friend who does all of our stonework in Kenya for us. He's very talented. So this is the last project I'll just talk about really quickly, just to show you what can we do within urban areas in regards to design and in regards to using indigenous species, trying to be sensitive to indigenous landscapes which would have been there previously. So this is some work that we've done for a mall, Sorry Centre in Westlands, in the centre of Nairobi. And our key starting point for this was essentially to create a forest. We did a roof garden and we did a few pedestrian walkways. And I'm just going to talk to you about the pedestrian walkways. And basically our whole starting and thinking of this was researching the indigenous species, which it naturally would have been forest here before. So we were looking at the indigenous species which would have grown here before, which would have been a lot of very tall forest trees. But of course, from a design perspective, we have to meet certain requirements. They have to be fast growing. They have to have, they can't bring key issues with roots. So it's quite hard to find indigenous trees that are suited to urban requirements. So this is one of our entrance ramps, pedestrian ramps, that essentially we've reforested with pioneer species, faster growing indigenous species that they're not endangered, but what they do is they produce a canopy as fast as possible. And then we'll see what happens later on. In a natural forest setting, the pioneer species start the canopy, and then the different bird life and things like that then bring in the slower growing tree species, the hardwood species. Of course, this is right in the urban area, so I'm not sure if that's going to happen. But essentially, our philosophy is to create an urban forest. And so we've got to combine the needs of the pedestrians, we've got to provide seating areas, we've got to provide areas where they can sort of put up tents for weekend markets and things like that. But from an ecological point of view, we're trying to plant as many, essentially we're trying to reforest this little patch, which is really important because of air quality and things like that. I mean, using indigenous species within urban areas can be hugely beneficial for everybody. And then this sort of green element on the behind there is we did a large green wall along a parking silo. So we made it all green, which again has been really, really successful. So now there's a whole big green facade in the center of Nairobi, and it's really amazing. It's full of birds nesting and things like that. So as well as our forest, next to our forest, we've got a big green box. So it's kind of fun, yeah, trying to see how responsible we can be in an urban area, I guess. And that's it. I hope I'm in time, Andy.
Yes, you are. Thank you, Chloe. Thank you to the three of you for these presentations, a range of different ideas around these landscapes, and lots of questions, lots of interest. I see a number of questions have been asked and answered already, and we can go through some of them. To begin, though, I'd actually like to ask the presenters if any of you have comments you'd like to make about the other presentations you've heard, or if you'd want to speak amongst yourselves. Maybe I think we could start with Joannes, or or in no particular order. Any of you want to open the forum?
So yeah, I guess, I don't know, I was really excited when you invited Matt, because I find it so interesting, the realities of sort of, the realities of human pressures, the reality there is not enough space to keep every forest, so I like your philosophy of for example, planting along farm boundaries and things like that, to reforest along boundaries. I find it really interesting and suitable to the pressures, I guess.
Thank you. Nice. Okay.
I had a question for Chloe. This was just, how do you decide which sort of indigenous tree to use where?
Through, I ask people like you. and Paul and Joannes. I ask Joannes all the time. I go, what is it? No. So in general, I mean, we're design, so I'm not a botanist in any way. Of course, through experience to a point, but my key thing is all about observation. So if we see something growing that's growing successfully, then that's definitely a starting point. And then, it's about working with people like both of you. I mean, I've asked you, Matt, questions before, and I ask with Joannes, I'm on the phone probably 3 times a day. I'm like, what do I plant here? So I think it's about, but the key thing for me is observation. Seeing what's there. I I think you can learn a lot just by looking.
Do you get a lot of demand from your clients? Like, have you seen demand changing, where becoming sort of more aware or more conscious of the use of indigenous versus exotic, or is it still something that you more suggest to your clients rather than people asking for it?
I think in general clients are very accepting not to go with exotics. I think it's becoming more and more well known, the pressures. And like, for example, we did a school with Local Works where we discussed with the client, a bit like the work that you were doing, that we do a demonstration timber plantation using indigenous species. And actually I worked with Joannes on that, didn't we? Joannes, we chose a species together, or you told me essentially, let's try this for that demonstration timber plantation. So that's growing now, and it reminded me of the one that you showed, very similar to that, trying to come up with alternatives for the grevillea and the eucalyptus. But it's fun. We were like, Felix and we were so happy because the client really embraced this idea of trying to resolve bigger issues in regards to the population pressure in Uganda, within the grounds of the school. So it was kind of fun. Yeah.
Sorry, can I come in?
Yeah.
Sorry, my question comes to Matt about the distribution of 60,000 indigenous trees. So do you keep a track record of whom you are giving your seedlings to? Then what about the survival of the species? So do you have problem having the locals to address the initiative, or what methodology are you using?
No, it's a very good question. It's also something we ask a lot of other NGOs, because a lot of organizations claim to plant, millions of trees, but no one actually goes back to see if they've survived a year later, and quite often they don't. So yes, we do keep a record of every farmer. We have a tree supply form, and we also have monitoring forms. So we very much over the last 5 years tried to develop a methodology that allows us to gauge how often we need to see a farmer to achieve what survival rate. So of the 60,000 seedlings that we've distributed, we've got somewhere between a 65 and a 70% survival rate. At the beginning, it was much harder because we were also learning which species work in which landscape. A farming landscape is not a very welcoming landscape for a tree. There's lots of risks and hazards: fire, goats, cows, pesticides, digging. And so trying to work out which species are going to work where, and also how to engage the farmers and in which frequency to ensure that we can still reach a large number of farmers, but also have an acceptable survival rate with the trees that we grow.
Thank you. I think
on the invasive sector, because most organizations, they spend a huge amount of most of their budget goes to invasive removal. So well, I'm impressed with what you are doing on the reusing or making use of invasive species to help the community in terms of energy, and well, that is a very good idea. So my point is, are you also doing outside the local area, or you're doing it in the conservation area?
We started the office. Sorry.
Because I'm sure that if the species spread to the next door neighbor, of course it will come back again. So whereby you'll use a huge amount of your budget to remove it again. So are you also doing the training on the locals, so how to get rid of or how to manage the invasive species?
Yeah, very much. So it's not us. We don't do the removal ourselves. We've simply trained people how to identify which species are invasive. And it started off a little bit by accident. We had done a training at Kyaninga on how to make eco charcoal. And it was by pure coincidence that the woman who was doing the training had mentioned that, by the way, if you happen to have any lantana, it's quite good for eco charcoal because it has quite a high oil content in the leaves and burns well. But as part of my research in Kibale, one of the areas we were looking at where the forest isn't recovering well, the representatives from the Ugandan Wildlife Authority were attributing that to lantana dominance. And so we just came up with the idea that wouldn't it make sense that if communities can use the lantana and the forest doesn't need it, that we could bring it together. So we don't do it just within the parks. We also do it along the borders of the parks. We only started doing this 2 years ago, so it's still quite new, but we are looking to expand it. One of the areas, for example, is in Panga Gorge, where the cycads grow. There is a very, very heavy dominance of lantana absolutely everywhere. And so hopefully in the next year or so, we will also start training communities there on how to identify it, how to remove it, and then how to process it.
So cool.
Cool. I'm going to ask Felix to ask his question. And then just a reminder also to everyone that you're welcome to raise your hand and ask questions yourselves as well.
Then in the meantime, I see there's also lots of questions in the chat box that some of the panelists can start responding to. One of them I just wanted to ask myself, maybe to Matt. Maybe I haven't fully heard it, or maybe you can still talk a little bit more about you know, this whole issue of exotic versus indigenous. And I mean, I fully understand the issue of invasive, but is anything exotic automatically invasive? Probably not. And therefore, is anything exotic automatically bad?
No, is the answer. I mean, if you think all of the vegetables that we eat, very few of them come from here. The majority of the fruit trees, mangoes, avocados, they don't come from here. So no, exotic doesn't automatically mean invasive, and exotic doesn't always have to have a negative consequence. Sometimes, you know, most mango trees provide, you know, they do virtually no harm, if any at all. Avocados can become invasive, but generally don't. So no is the answer. The problem is, even something as eucalyptus has definitely its place. It's just that traditionally it's planted in an area which is then sensitive to the negative consequences of eucalyptus. By that, I mean, eucalyptus is a very thirsty tree because it's a desert tree. So if you want it to grow fast, you plant it next to a swamp. But this has the side effect of draining the swamp. So although I'm almost completely against exotic species, if you have very degraded rocky soils where, you know, there are exceptions where I would say, okay, you know, very few indigenous species, it's not that very few indigenous species would grow there, but very few indigenous species would grow there and provide the growth rates that eucalyptus can. And so if you can keep things like eucalyptus away from the water table, so up on the top of a hill where it's very, very rocky, then I'm not totally against it because it provides very, very high quality timber. And so before we cut the mahoganies down in Bodongo, I'd rather have a eucalyptus plantation on the top of a rocky hill. So it's always a bit of a trade-off. It's just about where you plant the species and what will be the consequence.
Yeah, I think that's the issue, is when you're planting exotic, you're never sure of the consequence. There's always a higher risk. Whereas if you're planting something that is suited, because there's within the natural world, there's so many balances that we don't understand. So whereas the indigenous species are already, to a point anyway, it's easier for us to maintain that balance. Whereas humans coming in and we disturb the balance constantly, and that's why you have things like lantana going crazy, you know. So I think from a design perspective anyway, it's safer for us to use the indigenous species, especially in more sensitive environments and landscapes.
Okay.
And then also, I mean, Joannes, you work all the time with conservation, with endangered you know, species which are becoming endangered. And that's also something that's interesting for us from a design point of view is if we can include an element of conservation within the design, that's also fun. You know, say if every garden, every person's private garden in Kampala had an indigenous tree, and that indigenous tree, or three of them, one of them out of three, one was endangered, then we're playing our role even within urban areas to sort of maintain this balance of the ecology, which is kind of fun from a design point of view.
Okay. I'm going to allow Valerie to talk now, if that's okay. There you go. Go ahead, Valerie.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who talked and for just the presentation. Just talking about the indigenous planting. Does an indigenous tree cease to be indigenous if you bring it, say, for example, from Mount Elgon and you plant it in Fort Portal or something like that? Or is that proximity still, does that still allow for it to, I don't know, you still have some kind of value in it? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Where are the boundaries? How far does a plant have to move before it turns that point? Generally speaking, I would try to say that if it doesn't already naturally occur in an area in any quantity whatsoever, then if you're moving it, there's always a risk. It's like Chloe said, it's very difficult to know how a species that behaves one way in an area where it grows very slowly and doesn't reproduce very quickly, doesn't spread very quickly, in another area can behave completely different. Obviously, the shorter the distance between the two areas, the less likely that is, because birds would have transported the seeds, or wind could have transported the seeds, and so the chances of that species becoming a problem is less likely. But it is a bit of a question of where do you draw the line as to how far something has to move before it's exotic.
I also find it interesting that why are you moving plants from Mount Elgon to Fort Portal? What is it that you're looking for in that plant that you're moving? It tends to be it's ornamental, or it's good timber, or there's certain sort of uses that the reasons why we move these things. And I think a lot of our work is trying to educate our clients that there's a value in just embracing what's there, and that you can meet your needs with just what's there, I guess. But I don't know.
Thank you both. I'm going to allow Paul to speak next. There we go.
Thanks, Chloe, and thanks, Matt, and everyone. Going back to the same question with indigenous versus exotic breeds. I mean, here in Switzerland, we have this experience whereby the climate is changing so much that if actually we consider what's going to happen in about 20, 30 years, our forests are going probably to start, will have to be replaced with indigenous trees from the Mediterranean region. And I'm suspecting that in Uganda, my second home country, the climate has changed so much over the first generations that in different regions, we're going to be forced to, or we'll have to consider planting tree species that are not originating from that environment, just that we can accommodate or adapt future afforestation species, to the present climate or to the future climate in these regions. Would that then contradict the idea that in certain regions we should continue promoting local indigenous species, or we have actually to adapt to the fast changing climate conditions? That's a question for Matt.
It's a very good question. Just because the conditions changing doesn't necessarily mean you need to bring something from, say, Australia. Uganda has a very diverse landscape and also a very diverse climate. You know, there's very dry areas of Uganda and there's very wet areas like Fort Portal. So one of the solutions to be is if you can predict what you think the climate is going to be within one area. If you think, let's say Fort Portal is going to become hotter and drier, is that you would look, say, to somewhere like Kasese, which is much hotter and much drier, and try to take species from there and possibly start to integrate them to the system. So you don't have to go to the extent of maybe going to a different continent or to a different part of the world. You can still try to keep this as close to home as possible, if you get what I mean.
I also think it's interesting because in Europe, it's not tropical forest. you know, I don't know, Joannes and Matt, you can comment on the number of species per square meter in a virgin forest in the tropics. Isn't it a lot more than in Europe? So I think in Europe, yes, there is going to be a gradual change, but I still think it's most likely with species that are from the European continent, because again, within Europe, it's so diverse in regards to the conditions, and yet like for example, the different plants that are here is much more reduced than working within tropical East Africa, for example, in Europe, whether you're in the Mediterranean or if you're further north in Switzerland.
Yeah, that's true. Here you have so many species. Kibale, I think, has something like over 460 species, and that's just Kibale. I think in Uganda it's close to 600 or 700 species of tree. And so the chance of finding an indigenous tree that has the capabilities to deal with whichever climate is coming is much higher. Whereas in Europe, it's a very low number of trees that are remaining within the sort of forest landscapes. And also most forests within Europe aren't really forests anymore. They're sort of monocultural woodlots. They're pine plantations, things like that. And so yeah, their adaptability is much lower. Whereas the adaptability here, due to the high diversity, should buffer some of the effects of climate change, hopefully.
What do you think, Joannes, about that? It's an interesting point.
Joannes, you're muted. There we go. Okay.
Okay. Matt, come again.
Oh, it's me. I was saying, what do you think about climate change in regards to species? How it's affecting your work, for example?
Well, well, I'll say climate change it's a threat to, I think, some species. Like there's a species I collected. It was collected in 1943 from a place called Muda in Kenya. And like 43 years down the line, we went back there and we found nowhere to get it. So until we had to go right down to a place called Endao. That's when we found two species, two plants. So climate change is really a problem here. So yeah.
Okay.
Also, I think the range of species also is limited, and the species is, when the species is declining, so the geographical range of a species is limited, and the species also declines due to the
climate change. Yeah.
The climate change. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that question and discussion. We have a few more hands, so I'll just allow people. I think Hannah, if you have something you'd like to say, please do.
Yeah. I have about 1 million questions for Chloe, but I'm going to restrict it to just 2. The first one is about native species and planting native species. In the nurseries I've been finding, I haven't seen a lot that aren't exotic. There seems to be a really high demand for exotic species here in Kampala. Have you found it to be challenging, convincing your clients, and I think you did mention that it was a bit challenging convincing your clients to go with native species, but then even sourcing those species, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so sourcing is really hard. You've got 2 perfect examples right in front of you. Matt and Joannes are really is a really good source of indigenous trees. So we've not sourced trees yet from Matt, but we've spoken about it on quite a few projects. And with Joannes, I've sourced plants from him for projects actually all over East Africa, because he's a seed collector and does all this stuff all over East Africa. So For example, we're doing now a hermitage garden in Tabora, where the indigenous woodland is Miombo woodland, which is quite rare. And the hermitage is in the center of Tabora, and there's no indigenous species left in the whole property. And basically part of our philosophy with the client is we're going to re-establish this very rare Miombo woodland within the grounds. And nowhere in Tanzania can we find this species. And so we're actually sourcing them from Joannes, and he sends them on the top of a bus, and they arrive in Tanzania all shaken up. But at least we can source the species. And the species that we're choosing is we basically go on a hike in the Miombo woodlands, the little patch that's left near Tabora, and we choose the species that are naturally growing there. So as well as working with Joannes to bring in the initial trees, then we're also working with old mosaic in Tanzania, and we're asking them to basically walk and collect seed, and then we're adding to it that way. So it's really is starting from scratch. And it depends, like the project in the Masai Mara, the first one I showed you, that was all collected from seed from site, but that's faster because we were just using grassland species and shrub species, so it's a bit easier. But it's a problem, yeah, it's a problem. I mean, we do a lot of schools with local work, for example, and those ones, again, through observation, like we use species that, like what Matt was saying, the normal species that are used for hedging, like, because in a school you just want shade. And some of the indigenous species like the Ficus mitiliensis or some of the erythrinas, yes, they can be planted from just sticking a cutting into the ground, but it means that we can bring shade into the school, at least using indigenous species that are faster growing and easy to grow and easy to procure, because you just cut off a branch off a neighboring tree. So, I mean, in Africa, you have to be really creative, I guess. And then there's some amazing guys like these two who are a good source.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. My second question was about tree preservation. Something we've had a really hard time on our sites is dealing with tree preservation. I'm just moved to Uganda in September, and I'm from the northeastern United States. So tree preservation looks very different where I'm from. So I just wanted you to, if you could expand a little bit on the projects you showed us. There was some serious grading, especially with the trees where there's steps and things like that. Could you explain some of your methodology with that?
The tree preservation, you mean building around existing trees and not harming them, and things like that? Yeah, so the project in the Mara, which was using the steps, there were no major trees within those steps. And so I don't know, the root systems on those is not crazy. And we were just really careful. Like I said, like that's why I showed the picture of Gital, because he's just a superstar, the guy we work with in Stone, and he knows that I'm totally crazy and trying to protect roots and things like that. So it's just being careful, that's all. And in some of those scenarios, we maybe topped up a little bit of soil, you know, if the levels weren't exactly right. But in essence, I'm happy how we managed to achieve those steps moving down. And I saw another question. You mean in the Masai Mara, your question about the eucalyptus in the center of the path?
Yeah, just I assume you didn't do any soil compaction for that path around the root system there when you're kind of putting in that stonework. I wasn't sure if there were any other precautions that you guys took. And then there was another project, the one that was in Nairobi that you show. The trees looked like they were in very small little squares, which looks really beautiful. But I was wondering if that species was just really conducive to a small soil volume, or if you were able to do anything underground to provide more soil volume so they could get big and mature.
So in that point, they reach down to ground level on that ramp, that pedestrian ramp. There's a point where there's fill around the ramp that we had. Essentially, you've got structural walls underneath that created the planter, but the roots themselves reach down to ground level. Okay. And in regards to, we planted them small, but it's quite funny because when we started doing projects in France, all the landscapers freaked out because they said that the planters around the trees had to be at least 1 meter by 1 meter. And it's quite funny, but it depends on species what you can get away with. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Basically, we planted them small, the trees. So, and also they're planted quite close together. So I don't expect, you know, when you have a tree on its own in a field, it's going to get much bigger and the trunk's going to get much thicker. These trees are planted close together, and two, the nature of that croton species doesn't necessarily have a huge trunk. So that's why they're suited to that sort of, that design where it's planted closer together and with smaller holes that are exposed. I mean, the paving comes over the top. The planting hole is much bigger than that underneath the paving. You see, it's just
that's what I wasn't there.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's not like 30 centimeters down square.
Yeah, I anticipated it was probably bigger underneath the paving, but that's why I was asking. All right, thank you. That's really helpful. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Hannah. Michael, should we go to Michael next? No? This one.
Hello, Randy. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Hi, Randy. I actually asked a question to Joannes in the group. I was just asking. I wanted to know. I have a property I'm developing on an acre in an urban area. It has no trees, and I was hoping to plant some interesting trees. And I'd love to actually have an endangered tree, for example, at least one. And perhaps a decent exotic tree, or one or two exotic trees. So I wanted to know where you'd be able to get them in Kampala. I know Joannes said, Toro Botanical Garden, but is there anywhere else more central, like in Kampala, you could get anything like this or information on them?
Maybe Joannes, would you like to answer that one? Or?
Sure. I think he can get it from Toro. They can courier it to him. If he can, I can link him to a manager there. Also, I think Local Works can order for him, or the Studio FH at Local Works can order it for him so that he can pick it from Studio FH offices here. I think that will be the reliable source, place to pick it from. Then I can link them with the Toro Botanic manager to courier it to Kampala. It's easy. It will take maybe one night. Yeah. Yeah.
So there are no available. There are no kind of gardens within Kampala.
In Kampala, you will find all exotics and all these Mzungu plants. From foreign countries. Sorry. I'm sorry.
No. Fair enough.
I think we'll come up next time with a talk of, we'll say, gardening with the indigenous plants. I think that.
Yeah,
so that
I think.
Because everyone thinks that exotic is the best. So I think we'll come next time with another talk of gardening with indigenous plants.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest here about like what we can do as individuals and maybe even as people with projects, how we can kind of make a difference outside of farming. Okay.
Yeah, with
you can also Matt. Yeah? Sorry,
with development of the species, the rare species. So it depends where you're going to plant it. Then with the botanic garden, they will have to track your species, because most species that we give out, like the endangered or the rare ones, we will have to track it down, because maybe someone might nick it in future, or someone want to do a research on it. So you might send someone to you, or to your organization, or to your garden, like that. So endemic and endangered species, normally we keep a track record of that. So it's under the something called ABS, or access and benefit sharing. Someone might get an indigenous species, a rare species, and take it way back to US and try to commercialize it. So it's endangered plants are tracked. So that's good. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Thank you, Joannes. I'll actually reach out to you because I'd also like advice on what you'd recommend and so on. Once I give you an idea of where the property is and so on, it would be great to chat to you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that question. I think I will pass on to Felix now, maybe to wrap it up slightly, just like this talk, and then maybe just some closing remarks. But here we go.
Yeah, thank you, Randy, and thank you to the three speakers. It's been really interesting this evening. I like how the three of you have shown light on this issue from your various angles, and somehow it's been really informative and inspiring. We of course, you know, we're called Local Works for a reason. We like local, and as such, it's interesting to see how so many of the concepts that you guys have spoken about somehow directly also reflect on construction. Many, you know, let's say many of the principles that Chloe uses in her designs are very, very similar to the principles that the architects use in developing a contextual proposal. You know, you as you say, you see what's working. You go to a site and you try to find out what is working, or you try to find out what was working there, and then you try to, of course, then you're still creative with it. Then comes the design. But as a starting point, you look out for what's already there. I find that extremely interesting, and I want to thank you for your input and for being part of Local Talks. And I'm impressed about the amount of interest from people. We knew that landscape is a bit different in terms of the topics compared to what we have done before. We've always been a bit more around buildings and construction technology and stuff. So I find it really encouraging how many people are interested in this topic as well. So thanks a lot from my side.
Yeah, thank you, Felix. I think we can wrap up now. I think that's enough. If there are other questions left, we will share them. We can share them with you via newsletter. And I think there's a bit of information. I think the speakers are all willing to be contacted as well. So we might share that with you as the attendees. So thank you everyone for joining us again. When we make this available, we always make the presentations available on our YouTube channel to rewatch later on. So we will let you know again via our newsletter when that's ready. Yeah, and then we hope the next Local Talks will be in 3 months from now. So it will be in June, and we're hoping the next one might actually be in person. So we get to see some of you offline, hopefully, but somehow we'll try and still make it available online as well for people who can't attend, because it's been great to have people attending from all over the world, really. So yeah, I think that's everything from us. Thanks again to the speakers for joining us and preparing your presentations. Yeah, I think that's everything.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for having us.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Bye.
Good night.